The road into silence. The desert air was thick with dust and echoes of distant sirens. As the red sun began to sink behind the broken hills, a convoy of humanitarian trucks crawled through a narrow dirt road leading into a forgotten border town. At the front jeep sat Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, both wearing simple relief vests with faded patches that read, "Peace Initiative." Their faces were calm, but their eyes carried the quiet weight of people who had seen too much and still refused to give up on hope. No one in Hollywood knew they were here. No reporters, no cameras, no bodyguards. They had vanished 2 weeks earlier from a film premiere in London, leaving everyone guessing. Headlines speculated about a secret movie or a scandal, but the truth was hidden deep in the war-scarred valley they were now entering. The road curved around a collapsed bridge where the smell of burned metal still lingered. Sandra tightened her grip on the steering wheel as Keanu scanned the horizon. Smoke rose from the east, twisting like a black ribbon against the fading sky. Gunfire echoed faintly somewhere beyond the hills. He whispered almost to himself. "They said it was safe," she replied softly. "They said that yesterday, too." Their mission was supposed to be simple: deliver medical supplies to a children's hospital cut off by conflict, help the local volunteers restore power and communication lines. But as they crossed the checkpoint that morning, the local escort had disappeared, leaving them alone with a single guide, a young medic named Farah, barely 20, whose calm voice carried more courage than fear. The jeep rattled across broken concrete as Farah pointed to the horizon. "The hospital is past that ridge," she said, "but the last group that tried to reach it didn't come back." Sandra looked at her with quiet disbelief. "And you're still going?" Farah smiled sadly. "Someone has to, in that moment." Keanu looked at the young medic and saw something that reminded him of his own sister years ago. The same steady gaze of someone who had already accepted pain as part of life, but refused to stop caring. He knew they could still turn back, but he also knew they wouldn't. The first village they reached looked like a ghost town. Walls riddled with bullet holes, doors hanging loose, children's drawings fluttering on cracked school walls. Sandra stepped out first, carrying a crate of water bottles. She noticed a little boy hiding behind a burned-out car, clutching a toy soldier missing one arm. She knelt down and smiled. "Hey there, soldier," she said softly, offering him water. The boy stared for a moment, then whispered, "Is it true you can stop the bombs?" Her throat tightened. She simply said, "No, but maybe we can fix what they break." Keanu joined her, unloading boxes of medicine. The silence around them was heavy, broken only by the creak of a windmill spinning weakly. Farah handed out food packets to the few villagers who emerged cautiously. One old woman kept thanking them in a language they barely understood. Keanu just nodded, pressing his hands together respectfully. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they decided to rest in an abandoned school. Sandra lit a small oil lamp while Keanu inspected the cracked windows. "How long do you think we can stay unseen?" she asked. "Long enough to do what we came for," he answered. Farah spread a rough map on the floor, pointing to the hospital's location, a red cross drawn over a cluster of buildings surrounded by the words "Danger Zone." She explained that communications were down because a power station nearby had been destroyed. If they could restore it, the hospital could receive emergency signals again. That night, wind howled through broken glass. Sandra couldn't sleep. She walked outside and looked at the stars, the same stars that once glittered above red carpets and film sets. Only now they seemed colder. Keanu joined her, his steps quiet. "Do you ever think we're crazy for doing this?" she asked. "Maybe," he said with a small smile. "But maybe the world needs a little crazy that still believes in kindness." A distant flash lit the sky, faint, but close enough to make the ground tremble. The sound followed seconds later, a dull explosion. Sandra's heart pounded. Keanu turned toward Farah, who had already grabbed her radio. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by a panicked voice in broken English. "Help! Hospital! Under attack! Please!" The words faded into static. Farah looked up, eyes wide. "That's them. We have to move now." Keanu didn't hesitate. "Pack everything. We leave in 10 minutes. They drove through the darkness, headlights dimmed, following Farah's directions. The closer they got, the thicker the smoke became. Burnt fields stretched on both sides of the road. They passed a truck overturned in a ditch, its tires still warm. Sandra pressed her hand against her chest, whispering a silent prayer. Then, through the smoke, they saw flickering lights. The hospital. The building was small, its white walls blackened by fire. Several windows were shattered. Figures ran in and out, carrying stretchers. Keanu jumped out before the jeep stopped moving, rushing to help. Inside, the air was thick with dust and fear. Doctors worked under flashlight beams. Children cried softly in the corner. Sandra knelt beside a nurse wrapping bandages around a wounded child. "What do you need?" she asked. The nurse looked up, too tired to recognize her. Light, power, clean water, everything. Keanu spotted the generator at the back, twisted, leaking fuel. He called Farah, and together they pulled wires, patched cables, and scavenged tools. Keanu's hands trembled as he tightened bolts, his face smeared with dust. A soldier's voice shouted from outside, warning that the firing might resume. But he kept working. Minutes stretched into hours. Finally, the engine coughed, sputtered, and roared weakly to life. The lights flickered on. A faint cheer rose from the hall. Sandra looked around, faces lit with fragile hope. For a brief moment, the chaos paused. She walked toward a small ward where an old doctor was sitting beside a dying generator battery. He looked up and whispered, "You brought the light back." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "No, we just helped you keep it burning." As dawn broke, the smoke outside began to clear. Keanu stood near the window, watching a group of children being led out safely. Farah came to his side, holding a small blood-stained notebook. "This was left behind by a volunteer," she said. "It has names of people still trapped near the border. They were trying to bring food to a camp before communication was lost." Keanu turned to Sandra, his expression grave. "We can't leave yet," she frowned. "Keanu, we've done what we came to do. We need to rest." He shook his head. "They're still out there." Farah nodded. "It's only a few miles away, but the road is mined." Silence filled the room. Sandra closed her eyes for a long moment, then exhaled. "Then we find another way." Before they left, a little girl approached them with a drawing. Two people holding hands under a sky filled with stars. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. Sandra knelt, taking the drawing with trembling hands. "We'll be back," she promised, though she didn't know if it was true. Outside, the air smelled of smoke and rain. Their jeep was nearly out of fuel. Keanu loaded the last crates of supplies. Sandra placed the drawing on the dashboard. Farah looked at both of them, her voice barely steady. "Once we cross that hill, there's no turning back." Keanu looked toward the horizon where faint plumes of smoke still rose. His voice was calm, almost serene. "Then let's keep going." The engine started, rumbling like a heartbeat in the quiet morning. They drove toward the ridge where the road disappeared into mist. Behind them, the hospital's lights flickered weakly like candles trying to survive the wind. As they reached the top of the hill, Sandra looked back one last time. "What if this is the last thing we do?" she asked quietly. Keanu smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure it means something." The jeep rolled forward into the gray haze where the world seemed to end. Moments later, a distant explosion shook the valley again, louder this time. Birds scattered into the pale sky, and Farah's radio crackled once more. A new voice, frantic and broken. "Whoever is out there, turn back." The road ahead is gone. The signal cut off. The screen would fade here if this were a film. The sound of the engine would echo before silence swallows it. And somewhere in that silence, the question would linger. Were they too late? Or had they just entered the place where kindness would face its hardest test yet? The Valley of Lost Voices. The morning sky was heavy with clouds, turning the valley below into a blur of gray and smoke. Keanu Reeves sat silently in the jeep's passenger seat, watching the mist twist like breath over the ruined landscape. The road ahead had vanished into a deep crack where the earth had split open during last week's bombardment. The warning from the radio replayed in his mind. The road ahead is gone. Sandra Bullock stopped the jeep near the edge and turned off the engine. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of wind rushing through broken trees and Farah's shaky breathing in the back seat. They got out, stepping into mud that swallowed their boots. Farah pointed toward the distance. "The refugee camp is somewhere beyond that ridge," she said, voice trembling. But there's no bridge left now. The last flood took it. Sandra looked around, trying to find another path. There has to be another way. Farah nodded toward a narrow trail winding down the side of the hill. There is one, but it passes through the Valley of Lost Voices. The name itself sent a chill through them. Locals believed the valley was haunted, not by ghosts, but by echoes, the cries of those who had vanished during the first wave of the war. No one had crossed it safely in months, but they had no choice. Keanu tightened his backpack straps, glancing at Sandra. If the lost voices are real, maybe they're just waiting for someone to listen. She gave a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Then let's listen carefully." The trail was narrow and wet, carved between blackened rocks. Farah led the way, holding a small lantern even though it was daytime. The fog was so thick that it turned the world into pale white walls. Sometimes they could hear faint whispers, not voices but echoes of the wind twisting through hollow spaces. Sandra's heart pounded each time she heard what sounded like a child crying in the distance, only for it to vanish the next second. Keanu walked behind her, steady, silent, his eyes alert for landmines or traps. They reached the valley floor by noon. Wrecked vehicles lay half-buried in mud, and a stream of dark water cut across the path. Farah paused and knelt near a broken signboard half covered in ash. She wiped the dirt away. The words carved into it were barely visible. Peace Camp, 2 miles east. She looked up, whispering, "This is it." The camp was here once. As they walked further, the fog began to thin, revealing makeshift tents torn apart by storms. There were no people, only traces of lives once lived. Shoes scattered on the ground, a rusted wheelchair, a child's sketchbook lying open in the mud. Sandra picked it up gently, brushing away the dirt. The pages were filled with drawings of families smiling under blue skies. At the last page, the drawing changed. The sky turned dark, and the figures were gone. She felt her chest tighten as she whispered, "These were their dreams." Keanu approached a burned-out bus nearby. He noticed faint movement inside. He raised his hand to signal silence. Sandra froze. Farah stepped closer, holding her breath. Keanu slowly pushed open the metal door. Inside, huddled beneath a seat, was a small boy no older than 8, eyes wide with fear. His hands clutched a torn blanket. When he saw Keanu, he flinched, whispering something in another language. Farah knelt beside him and spoke softly. The boy hesitated, then burst into tears. "He says they all left him," she translated, "and that the voices told him to stay hidden." Sandra wrapped the child in her scarf. "We're here now," she said softly. "You're safe." The boy pointed toward a collapsed radio tower on the far side of the valley. "The others went there," Farah explained. "Maybe they're still alive." Keanu stood up, determination settling in his eyes. "Then that's where we go." As they made their way toward the tower, the wind picked up, carrying faint murmurs that almost sounded human. The boy clung to Sandra's arm. "They're calling me again," he whispered. Farah shook her head. "It's just the wind, love." But even she didn't sound convinced. Every few minutes, they would hear names echo through the fog, names none of them knew. Keanu stopped once and closed his eyes, listening carefully. The sound was strange. Not screams, not whispers, but something between sorrow and prayer. "They're not asking for help," he murmured. "They're reminding us they were here." When they finally reached the tower, they found 3 people hiding inside. A woman, her teenage daughter, and an injured man with a bandaged leg. They stared in disbelief when they saw strangers arriving from the mist. Farah spoke quickly in their language, explaining who Keanu and Sandra were. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "We thought the world forgot us," she said through Farah. Sandra shook her head. "The world forgets too fast, but we didn't come to film it. We came to change it." The man pointed to a pile of equipment near the wall. Radios, batteries, wires. "We tried to fix the transmitter," he said, "but we have no power." Keanu examined the parts carefully. "The generator might still work if we can clear the filters." For the next few hours, they worked side by side, cleaning, connecting, and testing wires. The injured man guided Keanu through local circuits, while Sandra comforted the children and made them warm soup from their last food packets. The boy from the bus sat close to her, still trembling, still watching the fog. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed outside. Gunfire. Everyone froze. Farah ran to the doorway and peeked through the mist. Silhouettes moved in the distance, soldiers or looters, it was impossible to tell. Keanu whispered, "We can't stay here." The injured man shook his head. "If we move now, they'll see us." Sandra turned to him. "If we don't, they'll hear us when the generator starts." There was no easy choice. Keanu finally spoke. "I'll go distract them." Sandra grabbed his arm. "You can't go alone." He looked at her quietly. "Someone has to buy you time." Farah stepped forward. "No, I'll go. I know the path's better." Keanu hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You're braver than you should ever need to be." As Farah slipped into the fog, the others waited in tense silence. Minutes felt like hours. The boy began to cry again, muffled by Sandra's scarf. Then, through the static of the half-repaired radio, a faint signal broke through. Farah's voice. "They saw me. I'm leading them away. Fix the radio. Don't stop." Keanu worked faster, his hands trembling. Sparks flew as the generator coughed to life. The transmitter light flickered on. Sandra grabbed the microphone. "This is Peace Convoy 1. We have survivors. Repeat survivors in Valley Sector 3. Need evacuation support immediately." The signal crackled, weak but alive. A faint reply came. "Copy that. Hold position." The relief was short-lived. Moments later, a loud explosion shook the valley. Sandra stumbled, dropping the mic. The boy screamed. Keanu rushed outside, searching through the fog. Farah's lantern was lying shattered near the rocks. There was no sign of her. The mist swallowed everything. Sandra's voice broke. "Keanu, she's gone." He stared at the empty horizon, fists clenched. "No," he whispered. "She gave us a chance. We'll honor that." He turned back toward the tower, determination burning behind his calm eyes. "We hold until help comes." Night fell slowly, painting the valley in deep shadows. The radio continued to hum faintly, a thin line connecting them to the outside world. Sandra sat with the children, telling soft stories about oceans and cities far away where no bombs fell. Keanu kept watch by the door, his face half lit by the flickering generator light. Somewhere in the distance, another explosion echoed, softer this time, but close enough to remind them they were still in the heart of danger. As the wind shifted, the whispers returned, softer now, almost gentle. Sandra looked up, startled. The boy beside her smiled faintly. "They stopped calling me," he said quietly. "They're singing now." She listened, and for a brief moment, the valley no longer sounded haunted. It sounded like a memory finally at peace. But then the radio crackled again, a new voice, urgent and unfamiliar. "This is Relief Command. The convoy has been delayed. Enemy forces approaching from the north. You must move immediately." Keanu turned to Sandra, his voice low but firm. "They're coming. We can't wait for help." She stood, eyes wide. "Where do we go?" He pointed to the far side of the valley where faint moonlight revealed a line of trees. "If we reach that forest, we can hide until dawn." They gathered what little they had, one lantern, a few supplies, the injured man supported by Keanu's shoulder. The woman carried the boy. The fog had thinned now, revealing faint shapes moving on the far ridge, shadows with rifles and flashlights. The group started moving quietly, every step echoing in the cold night. As they neared the tree line, the boy suddenly stopped. "Wait," he whispered. "I hear her." Sandra looked back. "Who?" His voice trembled. "The lady with the light." And there, far behind them, through the smoke and shadows, a single flicker of orange appeared. Farah's lantern, burning weakly on the rocks. Keanu froze, staring at it. Sandra's voice shook. "It's impossible." But he shook his head slowly. "No. She's still out there. The camera would linger here, on the distant lantern glowing like a heartbeat in the darkness, as the mist curls around it and the gunfire grows closer. And as Keanu takes one hesitant step toward that faint light, the screen would fade, leaving only the sound of wind and a child's whisper. The lost voices found her first. The light that would not die, the lantern's faint glow trembled through the mist like a living soul refusing to fade. Keanu stood frozen at the edge of the valley, torn between reason and something deeper, the quiet pull of faith. Sandra's hand tightened around his arm, her voice low but trembling. "If you go back now, you might not return." He looked at her, eyes steady yet heavy with grief. If she's alive, we can't leave her. Behind them, the survivors waited in silence, their faces pale in the moonlight. The boy clutched his mother's sleeve, whispering, "The voices are quiet now. Maybe they're leading her back." The wind howled, carrying distant sounds of engines and boots on gravel. Soldiers were moving closer, their flashlights cutting thin lines through the fog. There was no time for debate. Keanu handed his backpack to Sandra. "Take them to the forest. Follow the stream north until the hills rise again. I'll find her and meet you there." She shook her head violently. "You can't go alone." He gave her a faint smile that broke something inside her. "You said we came here to bring light, remember? Maybe that's where it's waiting." He turned before she could answer, disappearing into the haze. Sandra stood there for a heartbeat longer, torn between courage and despair, then forced herself to move. She guided the group toward the trees, helping the injured man stumble through mud and thorns. Every few steps, she looked back, hoping to see that faint orange glow again. It never disappeared, but it never came closer either. Just a stubborn pulse in the gray distance. Like a promise made by someone who never learned how to quit. Keanu moved quickly, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The fog was thick enough to swallow sound, yet he could hear faint echoes. Low voices, the crack of metal, the whistle of a shell somewhere far away. He ducked behind a broken wall and saw the lantern again, hanging from a jagged tree branch. Beneath it lay Farah, her clothes torn and covered in dust. She was breathing but weakly. Keanu rushed to her side, his heart pounding with relief. "Farah," he whispered, lifting her head gently. Her eyelids fluttered. "You came back." He smiled faintly. "You thought I wouldn't?" She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "They followed me." I led them toward the ridge. I think some of them didn't make it. Her gaze shifted toward the lantern above them. "I didn't want the light to die." Keanu glanced around. The sound of approaching footsteps was getting louder. He knew they had to move. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly, and he helped her up, supporting her weight as they stumbled through the mud. Every few steps she winced but never complained. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. "You risked everything." He smiled again. "So did you." Meanwhile, Sandra and the others reached the forest edge. The air there felt thicker, almost suffocating. Trees twisted in strange shapes, their branches forming claw-like shadows. The boy kept whispering to himself as if talking to the wind. "She's alive," he said over and over. "She's bringing the light." The mother tried to calm him, but even she seemed unsure. Sandra crouched beside him. "We'll wait here for them," she said softly, though she knew waiting meant danger. The sound of gunfire rolled faintly through the valley again. She looked up at the stars hidden behind clouds. "Please find your way, Keanu," she whispered. Back in the valley, Keanu and Farah reached a collapsed water tank. They ducked behind it as a group of armed men passed nearby, their radios crackling. Keanu held his breath, keeping Farah still. The soldiers' voices were low, foreign, and sharp. One of them shone a light across the field, pausing just inches from Keanu's face before turning away. They moved on, laughing harshly, disappearing into the fog. Keanu exhaled slowly. Farah looked at him with disbelief. "How do you stay so calm?" He shook his head. "I'm not calm. I'm just scared quietly." They resumed their path toward the forest, but the ground soon gave way beneath them, a hidden trench filled with rainwater. They fell hard, splashing into freezing mud. Keanu winced, pulling Farah out of the water. His knee was bleeding and her breathing had grown shallow. The trench led into an old drainage tunnel, half collapsed, leading who knew where. "We can rest here for a minute," he said. But she grabbed his hand. "No," she whispered, "we have to keep moving. The light must not die." As they crawled through the tunnel, they found a cluster of candles. Hundreds of them, melted into the stone. Some still burned faintly. Keanu looked around in awe. "Who did this?" Farah smiled weakly. "The villagers. They called it the Tunnel of Prayers. They lit these for the missing so their spirits could find the way home." She reached out and lit one candle with a trembling hand. "Now it's our turn." Keanu helped her light a few more, and soon the tunnel glowed softly, golden and warm against the gray walls. It felt sacred, untouched by war. He noticed an inscription scratched into the rock near one of the candles. It said, "When the world forgets your voice, let the flame speak for you." He whispered the words, feeling them settle deep in his chest. "Maybe that's what we're doing here." he said, keeping the voices alive. They finally emerged from the tunnel near the forest, soaked and exhausted. Keanu could see faint flickers of light between the trees. Sandra's lantern. He called out softly, "Sandra!" and she turned, relief flooding her face. The survivors rushed forward as Keanu helped Farah limp out of the darkness. The boy let out a cry of joy. "She brought the light back." Farah smiled faintly, the glow of the lantern reflecting in her eyes. "No," she whispered, "we all did." For a moment, hope felt real again. They gathered under the trees, sharing what little food they had. Sandra wrapped Farah in a blanket and checked Keanu's wound. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. He shrugged. "Nothing compared to what she's been through." Farah looked up at them both. "You're not like the others who came here before. You don't just give aid, you give faith." The forest was silent except for the rustle of leaves. Keanu leaned back against a tree, exhaustion catching up with him. "Faith isn't a word we use much anymore," he said. "Maybe it's time we do again." Before anyone could respond, a distant rumble shook the ground. It wasn't thunder, it was tanks. The mother's face turned pale. "They found us." Sandra looked around frantically. "There has to be another way out." Farah pointed toward the east. "There's an old railway tunnel. If we reach it, it leads to the mountains." Keanu stood up, gripping the lantern tightly. "Then that's where we go." They packed quickly, moving through the forest shadows as engines roared behind them. "Every few steps?" Farah coughed, growing weaker, but refused to stop. Sandra took the boy's hand, whispering calm words to keep him quiet. The night stretched endlessly, a blur of fear and determination. Somewhere behind them, flares lit up the valley, painting the world in red. They finally reached the railway tracks, rusted, half-buried under weeds. The tunnel loomed ahead, a dark mouth waiting in silence. Sandra hesitated. "What if it's a dead end?" Keanu looked at her with tired eyes. "Then we'll make it a way through." As they entered, the echo of their footsteps filled the vast hollow space. The lantern's flame flickered against the stone, revealing faded murals, old paintings of peace marches, children holding hands, slogans about unity. The boy stopped to touch one of them, whispering, "They were like us once." Sandra smiled softly. "And they will be again." Deep inside the tunnel, they found abandoned carts and broken crates. Keanu helped Farah sit down, her breathing ragged. She looked at him, tears in her eyes. "You kept your promise. You didn't let the light die." He shook his head slowly. "It wasn't just me." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's what kindness really is. The part of us that refuses to die, even when everything else does." Before he could answer, a sharp noise echoed from the tunnel's mouth. Boots, voices, metal scraping stone. They had been found. Sandra's face went pale. "They're here." Keanu grabbed the lantern and whispered, "Take the others and go deeper. I'll slow them down." Farah tried to protest, but he pressed her hand gently. "This light came from you. Now, let it guide them." The others hurried into the shadows as Keanu stayed behind, standing at the mouth of the tunnel, holding the lantern high. Footsteps grew louder. For a brief moment, the flickering flame illuminated his face. Calm, resolute and kind, even in the face of danger. As the first soldier appeared in the darkness, the screen would fade, leaving only the sound of a heartbeat and the soft glow of a lantern that refused to go out. The bridge of echoes, the tunnel shook with the thunder of boots and the metallic click of weapons being loaded. Keanu stood alone near the entrance, the lantern trembling in his hand. His heart beat calmly, almost unnaturally so, as though the fear had burned away, leaving only purpose. The soldiers' voices grew clearer, harsh, foreign, and methodical. They were searching the tunnels one by one. Behind him, the faint glow of the lantern flickered across the old murals, painting him in soft amber light. He whispered under his breath, "Let them find me, not them." He moved quietly through the shadows, placing the lantern on a crate where its glow spilled across the stone floor. It was bait, a decoy of warmth in a place of fear. He crouched behind a steel beam as the first flashlight beam sliced through the darkness. A soldier approached the lantern, confused. Keanu waited, his breath shallow. When the man bent closer, Keanu threw a rock down the opposite corridor. The sound echoed like a footstep, and the soldier turned instantly, shouting a warning. Chaos erupted. Footsteps, orders, the echo of gunfire disappearing into the wrong direction. Keanu slipped deeper into the tunnel, vanishing into blackness. Further ahead, Sandra and the others pressed against the damp walls, holding their breath as the sound of gunfire grew distant. Farah clutched her chest, whispering prayers. The boy hid his face in Sandra's coat, trembling. The injured man winced in pain but stayed silent. The silence after the noise felt heavier, almost sacred. Sandra closed her eyes, her mind racing between hope and dread. She wanted to believe Keanu was still alive, but a part of her feared the worst. She had seen bravery before, but never one that walked so quietly toward danger. After what felt like hours, the noise faded. Farah opened her eyes. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice faint but firm. "This tunnel goes east. There's an old bridge beyond the mountain. If we cross it, we'll reach the border." Sandra nodded, gathering their few belongings. "Then we keep moving. Keanu will find us." The tunnel sloped upward, its walls narrowing as they climbed. Shafts of faint moonlight seeped through cracks in the ceiling, guiding them like tiny stars. After a long walk, they reached an opening, a massive steel bridge stretching across a deep canyon. Below, mist swirled over jagged rocks. The bridge was half broken, its rails twisted, but it was their only way forward. Farah stared at it, fear flickering in her eyes. "They call it the Bridge of Echoes," she whispered. "If you listen too long, you'll hear the ones who never made it across." Sandra looked out over the chasm. The wind was cold and sharp, carrying distant howls that might have been just wind, or memories. She turned to the group. "We move one by one, slow and quiet. No matter what you hear, don't stop." They began crossing. The boards creaked under their weight. Each step sent echoes spiraling into the canyon, like ghosts whispering back. Sandra held the boy's hand tightly as they moved, eyes fixed on the faint light at the other end. Halfway across, Farah stumbled, clutching the rail. "My leg," she gasped. The bridge swayed violently. Sandra rushed to help her, but the movement caused a loose plank to snap. The injured man grabbed the ropes just in time, hanging half over the edge. The others froze, too afraid to move. Sandra crawled forward, gripping the cold steel cables, pulling him up inch by inch. Her arms burned with pain, her breath shallow, but she didn't stop. The man's hand slipped once, and for a heartbeat, time froze. Then, suddenly, another hand reached from behind. Keanu's. He was bruised, covered in dust, but alive. With one powerful pull, he lifted the man to safety. Sandra stared at him, tears flooding her eyes. "You made it." He smiled faintly, his voice soft. "I told you, the light doesn't die that easily." The boy ran to hug him, whispering, "I knew you'd come back." Keanu patted his shoulder gently. "Then I guess I had to." They regrouped, but the bridge was groaning louder now. Keanu looked back. Flashlights glimmered at the far end of the tunnel. The soldiers had found them again. He shouted, "Move! Everyone run!" The group hurried forward, the boards cracking under their feet. Farah limped. Sandra supported her, and the boy carried the small lantern that barely burned now. Halfway across, a burst of gunfire rang out. Bullets hit the metal beams, sending sparks flying into the night. The bridge shuddered violently. Keanu turned, firing warning shots from the soldier's pistol he had taken earlier. One of the ropes snapped with a deafening crack and the entire structure tilted. Sandra screamed, grabbing the boy before he slipped. Keanu reached for Farah, pulling her close. The world seemed to hang in mid-air for one impossible second. Then the bridge split in two. The section they stood on dropped, slamming into the canyon wall. Pain exploded through Keanu's shoulder as he caught a cable with one arm. Sandra, Farah, and the boy were clinging to another section that hung lower, barely held by twisted metal. "Don't let go!" Keanu shouted. Farah's hand slipped, but Sandra caught her wrist, straining with every muscle in her body. Farah looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Save them," she whispered. "You can't hold all of us." Keanu reached across the gap, his fingers bleeding as he grabbed the rope. "Nobody gets left behind!" he growled. He swung toward them, ignoring the pain that ripped through his shoulder. The cable creaked and began to snap strand by strand. Below them, the canyon looked endless. In that moment, Farah made a choice. She smiled faintly at Sandra. You brought the light this far. Keep it safe." Before Sandra could react, Farah let go. Her body fell silently, disappearing into the mist below. The boy screamed. Sandra froze, unable to breathe. Keanu's shout broke through the noise. "Move now!" He pulled them upward, climbing with sheer force until they reached the far side of the canyon. They collapsed onto solid ground as the last cables snapped, sending the rest of the bridge crashing into the abyss. For a long time, no one spoke. The lantern lay on its side, still burning weakly. Sandra stared at it, whispering she was right. It's still alive. Keanu sat beside her, his face shadowed but calm. She didn't die for nothing. She made sure we got through. They built a small fire near the rocks, using scraps of wood from the bridge. The boy sat beside Sandra, silent, clutching the lantern. Keanu looked at the canyon, the mist curling like smoke over the ruins. "The world will never know her name," he said quietly, "but maybe it'll feel her kindness somewhere." "Maybe that's enough." Sandra nodded slowly. "Maybe that's how heroes live forever, not in stories, but in the lives they save." The wind carried the faint echo of a woman's laughter. Or maybe just memory. It drifted through the canyon like a final goodbye. Keanu stood up, staring into the distance. "We can't stop here," he said. "The border is close. The children's hospital we helped. It's on the other side." They packed their things and began walking toward the mountains. Dawn was breaking, painting the clouds in soft pink light. Every step felt heavier but also purer, as though grief itself had become strength. Sandra walked beside Keanu in silence, her eyes still red. The boy followed behind, carrying the lantern proudly like a sacred relic. As they climbed higher, they saw smoke rising from the horizon. Not destruction this time, but campfires. The sound of voices drifted through the wind, human and alive. Farah's sacrifice had brought them here. But as they approached the border ridge, Keanu stopped. Something felt wrong. In the valley below, soldiers were gathering, not enemies, but rescue convoys. Yet none of them looked peaceful. Their trucks bore no symbols, no flags. Sandra frowned. "Who are they?" Keanu narrowed his eyes. "Those aren't relief teams." Before anyone could move, a flare exploded in the sky, burning red. The signal of danger. The story would pause here. The wind rising again, the bridge collapsing in echoes behind them, and the light, that fragile trembling flame, would flicker in the boy's hand, casting long shadows over faces carved by loss, but kept alive by something stronger than fear. The last convoy, the red flare still burned above the mountains, painting the dawn sky like a wound that refused to close. Keanu, Sandra, and the survivors stood frozen on the ridge, the cold wind biting at their faces. Below them, the valley was alive with movement, armored trucks, men in mismatched uniforms, and the distant glint of weapons. Farah's sacrifice had brought them this far, but the path ahead was no longer a promise. It was a trap waiting in daylight. Sandra knelt beside the boy, whose small hand still clutched the lantern. The flame flickered weakly, its glass cracked from the fall. "We have to protect the light," he whispered, his voice trembling. She brushed his hair gently. "We will, but we have to keep moving." Keanu scanned the terrain through broken binoculars he had found near the bridge. The road ahead led down toward the valley, the only route to the border, but it was crawling with armed patrols. "They're not soldiers," he murmured. "They're scavengers. They take whatever the war leaves behind." The injured man leaned against a rock, his voice barely audible. "There's another way, a dry riverbed that runs behind those cliffs. If we follow it, we might reach the relief zone." Keanu nodded. "Then that's our way." He turned to Sandra. "But we'll need to move fast before they notice us." As they began their descent, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke and oil. The valley below was littered with abandoned trucks, their frames twisted by heat. Some still bore faded symbols of humanitarian aid, now painted over with crude marks of warlords. Sandra's stomach turned at the sight. How many times can kindness be stolen before people stop trying? Keanu's answer was quiet but firm. "It's never stolen. It just changes hands." They reached the riverbed by noon. The sun had risen high, harsh and merciless. Their shadows stretched long across the cracked earth. The boy walked beside Keanu, holding the lantern close to his chest as though it could protect them from the world. "Why do bad men want the good things?" he asked. Keanu looked down at him, thinking carefully. "Because good things remind them of what they lost. And sometimes, that hurts more than anything." The group stopped to rest near a cluster of rocks. Sandra shared the last of their water, her hands shaking from exhaustion. The injured man's wound had reopened and his face had gone pale. "Leave me here," he said weakly. "You'll move faster without me." Sandra shook her head. "We don't leave anyone behind." Keanu wrapped a strip of cloth around the man's leg and looked him in the eyes. "You didn't stop when it was your turn to help others. Neither will we." They moved again, but the sound of engines began to rise behind them. Keanu looked back. Dust clouds were forming on the horizon. The scavengers had spotted them. "Run!" he said, his voice low but urgent. "Don't look back." They ran through the dry gorge, their footsteps echoing off the stone. The boy stumbled once, but Sandra caught him, pulling him close. The roar of trucks grew louder. Bullets cracked through the air, kicking up dirt around them. As they rounded a bend, they saw a line of rusted train cars blocking the path ahead, remnants of an old cargo line that had been bombed years ago. It was their only chance for cover. Keanu led the way, helping the others climb inside a shattered carriage. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of burned metal. They crouched low, listening as the trucks drew closer. Sandra held the boy tight, whispering, "Stay quiet. Whatever happens, stay quiet." The truck stopped just outside. Voices shouted commands, boots crunched gravel. Through a hole in the carriage wall, Keanu watched men jump out, scanning the gorge with rifles. One of them held a flare gun, another carried a radio. Their leader wore a red scarf and carried himself with the cruel confidence of someone who had seen too much blood to remember mercy. Keanu recognized the emblem on his arm, a stolen insignia of a defunct peace force. Irony carved into fabric. Minutes stretched into eternity. One of the scavengers began walking toward the train, his boots echoing closer. Sandra's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The boy pressed his face into her coat, trying not to breathe. Keanu reached for a loose piece of metal on the floor, ready to strike if he had to. The footsteps stopped just outside their carriage. The man sniffed the air, muttered something, then turned back. Their truck engine started again. Slowly, painfully, the sound of the convoy faded. When silence returned, no one moved for a long time. Finally, Sandra exhaled shakily. "We can't keep hiding like this." Keanu nodded. "You're right. We move at night." They waited for sunset, resting in turns. Sandra found an old photo wedged between two boards. A picture of relief workers smiling beside the same train years ago, before it became a graveyard. She stared at it for a long moment. "They came here to help too." Keanu looked at the photo and then at her. "Maybe we're finishing what they started." When darkness finally fell, they left the train and followed the riverbed toward the mountains. The moonlight reflected off scattered pools of water, turning the path into a ribbon of silver. The night was quiet except for the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. After hours of walking, they saw faint lights ahead, flickering fires and tents. Sandra's heart leapt. "It's the relief camp." Keanu slowed his pace. "Or it's something pretending to be one." They approached cautiously. The air smelled of cooked rice and diesel. Figures moved around the fires, wearing mismatched uniforms. It looked peaceful at first, until they saw the cage. Inside it were families, bruised and silent, guarded by armed men. One woman was cradling a baby, humming softly to keep it from crying. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. "They're holding them as bait." Keanu's jaw tightened. The last convoy. He realized then what the rumors meant. These men were not helping refugees. They were using them to lure more aid trucks into ambushes. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. "We can't just walk away." Keanu's reply was quiet but steady. "No, we can't." He studied the camp carefully. "There's a power truck near the back. If we cut the lights, we can free the cages before they know what's happening." The injured man looked up. "I can do that." Sandra shook her head. "You can barely stand." He smiled weakly. "Then they won't expect me to be the one." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to prove anything." The man looked toward the captives. "I already did once. Now I just have to finish it." They waited until midnight. The boy hid behind a pile of crates, clutching the lantern. The flame was nearly out, but it still burned faintly, like a pulse refusing to fade. Keanu crept toward the cages, moving through the shadows. Sandra stayed close, helping guide the families out once the locks broke. The injured man crawled toward the power truck, dragging himself along the ground. Each breath was a battle. When he reached the generator, he looked back at the others, then smiled. The camp plunged into darkness. Panic erupted. Guards shouted, flashlights scattered across the ground. Keanu shouted, "Go now!" The families ran toward the rocks, carrying their children. Gunfire cracked the air, bullets whizzing past. Sandra helped the mother with the baby climb onto a truck, pushing it down the slope. "Keep going!" she yelled. Behind them, the injured man lit one final flare, a bright, blinding light, before the explosion swallowed him. The blast shook the valley, tearing through the scavengers' camp. Keanu turned, shielding Sandra from the wave of heat. Debris rained down like burning stars. The families ran through the smoke, guided only by the lantern's fading glow. The boy held it high, his small voice crying out, "This way! This way!" The flame caught the reflection of hundreds of frightened faces finding hope again. When the dust settled, they were miles from the camp. Dawn began to break once more, washing the sky in pale orange. The survivors gathered on a rocky hill, exhausted but alive. Sandra's clothes were torn, her hands trembling, but she smiled for the first time in days. Keanu stood beside her, staring back toward the valley. Nothing remained but smoke. The boy brought the lantern to him. "It's almost gone," he said softly. Keanu knelt, cupping the glass gently, then let it burn out in peace. "It's done enough." But before he could say more, a faint voice crackled from a small radio he carried, a transmission, distant and full of static. "To any survivors near Sector 9, this is International Relief Command. We received your signal." "Repeat, we are inbound," Sandra gasped, tears welling again. "They heard us." Keanu smiled faintly, looking at the boy, then at the horizon where helicopters were beginning to emerge through the morning haze. Maybe kindness really does find its way home. As the engines roared above and rescue teams descended, Keanu took one last look at the lantern. Its flame finally flickered out, but instead of darkness, the valley below filled with light, sunlight reflecting off new tents, moving figures, and a sense of life returning. The world would never know the full story. Cameras would arrive later, long after the fear had faded, to film what they called the last convoy. But those who were there would remember differently. They would remember a man who refused to give up, a woman who carried hope in her eyes, and a small lantern that burned longer than anyone thought possible, and somewhere in the mist, Farah's voice would whisper softly, carried by the wind that once haunted the valley, "The light never dies. It only changes hands." The return of light. The helicopters circled low over the ruined valley, their blades slicing the morning haze into ribbons of light. Dust rose around the survivors like ghosts, finally letting go of the earth. Keanu stood quietly at the edge of the ridge, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt and ash. Beside him, Sandra watched the first rescue teams rush down toward the families. She could hear the distant sobs of relief, the sound of children laughing for the first time in weeks, and the hum of engines that no longer meant danger. It should have felt like an ending, but it didn't. It felt like the beginning of something fragile, a promise trying to find its shape. A medic approached, handing Keanu a bandage. "Sir, you need treatment." He shook his head gently. "See to the children first." Sandra smiled faintly. "You never learn, do you?" He looked at her, exhaustion softening his voice. "If we stop caring, we stop being human." The boy came running toward them, holding the lantern in both hands. Its glass was cracked, the wick blackened, but his eyes sparkled with pride. "It still shines," he said. Keanu crouched to his level, brushing the dust from his hair. "You carried it through the dark. Now it's yours." The boy's small face turned solemn. "But you need it more than me." Keanu smiled. "No, I think it found who it was looking for." The medic called for them to board the helicopter. Sandra helped the boy climb in while Keanu turned for one last look at the valley. The morning sun spread across the shattered landscape, touching every ruin, every scar, and every place where kindness had left its mark. For a moment, he saw Farah standing near the canyon, her lantern whole again, her face calm. When he blinked, she was gone. Only light remained. The helicopter lifted off, rising slowly above the mountains. From above, the world looked smaller, almost peaceful. Smoke curled from the remains of the scavengers' camp, but near the river, relief tents were already being set up. Sandra looked down and whispered, she'd be proud of this. Keanu nodded. She'd tell us to stop staring and get back to work. They landed hours later in a larger camp near the border, where doctors, volunteers, and aid workers rushed to help the new arrivals. Cameras flashed, journalists shouted questions, but Keanu and Sandra kept their distance. They didn't come for headlines. They came for the silence that follows after help arrives. A young reporter approached, holding a microphone. People are saying 2 foreigners led the rescue and that you walked into the war zone. Is that true? Sandra looked at her, tired but calm. The truth is, we didn't walk into a war zone. We walked into people's lives that the world had forgotten. Keanu added softly, and they reminded us that kindness can survive anything. The clip would later go viral, but neither of them stayed to see it. Instead, they spent the next few days helping rebuild the medical tents, cooking meals, and comforting children who had lost their parents. The boy followed Keanu everywhere, carrying the lantern like a badge of honor. Sometimes he would stop and whisper to the flame as if talking to Farah. One evening he asked, "Will the light ever come back again?" Keanu smiled gently. "It already has. Look around you." Weeks passed. Peace talks began, and international aid flooded in. The valley was declared a safe zone. Yet, even in safety, the memories of what they had seen lingered. One night, after the camp had grown quiet, Sandra found Keanu sitting near a fire, staring at the sky. "You haven't slept in days," she said softly. He nodded. "I keep thinking about her. Farah, the others. All the ones who didn't make it." She sat beside him, her voice steady. "Maybe they didn't leave. Maybe they became the light we carry now." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the fire. "You really believe that?" She smiled. "I have to. Or else all we did was survive, not live." The next morning, they said goodbye to the camp. The boy ran up to them, handing the lantern back. "Keep it," he said. "I made another one?" He showed them a small tin lamp he had built from scrap metal, burning bright in his hands. Keanu knelt, his voice soft. "You're building light now. That's what the world needs." As they walked away, the camera crews shouted their names again, but neither turned around. They left quietly, like they had arrived, without fanfare, without applause. Months later, in a city far from the valley, a new building opened, the Farah Foundation for Quiet Kindness. Its plaque bore no mention of fame or film stars, only a single line engraved in simple words. Light is not something we hold. It's something we pass on. Children from war zones studied there, learning to build clean energy lamps, radios, and shelters. The boy, now a little older, helped teach them. He told stories about a man who refused to give up and a woman who never stopped believing. He said the lantern was still burning somewhere, carried by hands that helped others. In the final scene, years later, Keanu and Sandra stood together on a small hill overlooking a city rebuilt from ashes. The wind was warm, the sky clear. She held a new lantern, its flame steady and bright. He smiled quietly. "The world keeps finding ways to heal itself," he said. "Maybe it's because people keep trying, even when no one's watching." Sandra nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. And maybe the light never really needed saving. It just needed someone to carry it long enough for others to see it again. The camera would pull back slowly, showing the city below, glowing lights scattered across rooftops, rivers and streets like a constellation reborn. In the middle of it, the Farah Foundation's roof shone brighter than all, its symbol a small lantern carved into glass. The wind carried a single voice through the quiet, Farah's, soft and full of peace. You kept the light alive, and somewhere beyond the noise of the world, where kindness and courage meet, the light continued to move, from hand to hand, from heart to heart, never fading, only changing form.